How often do we slip into the thinking that if life is going well, if things are going well, God is really blessing us. But if things aren't going so well, then God is punishing us, or God is angry, or God is trying to teach you some sort of lesson. You know, I was talking with a guy just recently, and he and his family are going through this terribly difficult time, and he says, why is God doing this to us? And what is God trying to teach us? And it's like this thinking that says, if you could just figure out why God is doing this, and if you could figure out what the supreme lesson is, and you could learn it, then maybe you could get back on the right path, and God will bless you again. And you know, sometimes people, they leave church for an extended period of time, and then they come back. And what I've noticed is most people aren't coming back on a winning streak. They come back when things have turned a bit south. And sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes they say things subtly like, well, man, if I can just get my life back on track with God, then life will be better again, and God can start blessing me again. Like, where did this come from? How did we get there? Did we just come up with this? Did we make it up? And so for the next few minutes, I want to explore with you the idea of the system of religious sacrifice. The early humans, they came to the realization that their survival as a species depended on things like food and water. And in order for food to grow, you need the right amount of water and sun. And too much rain and things simply wash away, and not enough rain, not enough water, things die. And the same with the sun. Too much sun, plants wilt, and not enough sun, and things die as well. And so these very basic and simple observations about how the world works led people to the conclusion that there are these unseen forces at work in the universe, and these forces you can't control, and yet your lives, your survival is dependent on these forces, these unseen gods up there somewhere. And so the belief came about that these forces are either on your side or they're not. And see, you would do everything when your harvest comes in, because keep in mind the question is, how do you get the gods? How do you get the forces on your side? And once they're on your side, how do you keep them on your side? And so when your harvest comes in, you would set aside a portion of your crops. You would sacrifice those crops to the gods, of course. And if it was a good year for your livestock, well, then you need to bring up one of your cows to the altar and sacrifice one of those cows and as an expression of gratitude to the gods. And if things weren't going well, if there wasn't enough rain, or if there was too much sun, then maybe the gods are angry with you. Maybe you didn't give enough last year, so this year, even though you have fewer crops, you need to bring a bigger portion and sacrifice them to the gods. If your animals, if they weren't healthy and it was a bad year for the livestock, well, then maybe the gods weren't appeased with you. And so what do you need to do? You need to bring maybe 2 cows to the altar and throw in a goat and a lamb. And you see what happens in the system. In the system of religious sacrifice, it always escalates. You just keep having to give more because the gods and the forces demand more and more and more. And in this anxiety-producing system, you never really know where you stand with the gods. We even have stories from the prophets of Baal dating back 4,000 years ago in the land of Canaan. And they would literally go to their altars, take out knives, and they would begin cutting themselves, adjusting the flesh. And they would say to the gods, is this enough? Will you bless us now? Will you provide for us now? Because look how devoted we are. We're even shedding our own blood for you. Will you give now? And see, we hear stories like this. We hear this history, and we say, how primitive, how barbaric, how could anyone ever do this? And thank God we don't do this in our culture. Really? How many young people do you know that stand at the altars of not feeling worthy enough, not being enough, literally taking out knives, cutting themselves. God, do you see me now? Am I enough now? Am I worthy enough now? Can things be different now? And see, if you really want to show the gods that you're devoted, well, what's the most valuable thing you could give? Your child. Which brings us to Genesis chapter 22, a story about Abraham and Isaac going up a mountain. This is one of the most forward-thinking stories in all of Scripture. So I want you all to hear it with new ears this morning. It goes like this. After these events, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. Abraham answered, I'm here. And God said, take your son, your only son whom you love, which, by the way, the first mention of love in the Scriptures. Take your son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him up as an entirely burned offering there on one of the mountains that I will show you. Abraham got up early in the morning, harnessed his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, together with his son Isaac. He split the wood for the entirely burned offering, set out, and went to the place God had described to him. And let's just pause there for just a moment. Because don't you get to this point in the story and you're like, hold up. Why is Abraham not just a little bit shocked at this request from the divine? Now, if it were you or me, we would protest just a little bit, right? Like, no, God, I don't want to give up my child. If I came to you this morning and said, listen, y'all, I spent some time in prayer last night, and me and God, we were doing our thing, and God said he wanted me to sacrifice my son, and so later today, Breck and I, we're going to head up to the mountains, y'all would think I'm crazy, right? Some of you would run out with your cell phones calling Child Protective Services, as you should. Abraham isn't at all shocked at this. Why? It's like Abraham says, okay, God, what time you want to meet? Why? Because Abraham lives in a very particular space and time and culture and people. This is how the gods are. This is how the world works. They keep demanding more and more and more. And if I want my family to survive, well, then I've got to make this sacrifice. This is how the world works. Let's keep going. On the third day, verse 4, on the third day. Let's pause there for just one more moment. Because what happens on the third day? When you come across that phrase in Scripture, and it's all over the place, think of Easter. What happens on the third day? Resurrection, new life. The story's transformation. The storyteller is giving us a huge heads up. Pay attention. Y'all don't want to miss the new thing that's happening in this story. Pay attention. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in a distance. Abraham said to his servants, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will walk up there, worship, and then come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the entirely burned offering and laid it on his son Isaac. He took the fire and the knife in his hand, and the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father? ? Abraham said, I'm here, my son. Isaac said, here's the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the entirely burned offering? ? That had to be an awkward conversation. Abraham said, the lamb for the entirely burned offering? ? God will see to it, my son. The 2 of them walked on together. They arrived at the place God had described to him. Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He tied up his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, don't lay a hand on that boy or do anything to him. And let's pause there for just one moment. Because if you're an ancient hearer of this story, you could hear a pin drop. I mean, everyone's jaws would have been lying on the floor. What kind of God stops a sacrifice? I mean, what kind of God would stop a sacrifice of this magnitude? And the storyteller says, this God. Let's keep going. 2 more verses. Abraham looked up and saw a single ram caught by its horns in the dense underbrush. Abraham went over, took the ram, and offered it as an entirely burnt offering instead of his son. Abraham named that place the Lord sees. That is the reason people today say, on this mountain the Lord is seen. One of the most forward-moving, forward-thinking, progressive stories in all of Scripture. Because it's like God says to Abraham, look, my boy, I know you and your people, you're so used to the gods demanding more and more from you. Even the thing that's most valuable to you, and you've made so many sacrifices, and just stop. It's not what I want. Stop. It's like the storyteller says, this is a brand new day, because the story ends not with Abraham's greatness. It is not a story about how great Abraham is and how faithful and loyal he is. The story ends with a statement about who God is. The story ends with God providing. Their fundamental human response was, what must we do? I love that y'all are doing this right now. I didn't expect it, but I love it. I feel like it's a kind of a sacred moment. I need to sit down. Thank you all. Set aside. Fundamental question, what must we do to appease the gods? What must we do? How much must we give? And this story says nothing. It's a story about a God who doesn't demand anything, but instead gives and blesses and loves, because that's who God is. It's a story about a God who says stop. And do you see how mind-blowing this would have been? And do you see how mind-blowing it still is today? And some of y'all may be thinking, yeah, but Pastor, what about the animal? I mean, God still needed a sacrifice, right? I mean, what about the ram that was caught in the underbrush? God didn't need that. Abraham needed it. Keep in mind, Abraham's still in an old system. Because think about your own lives. You don't just step out of an old system all at once and get on a new path. It's baby steps. It takes a process. It's about progress, not perfection. Abraham thought God wanted the sacrifice. God provides for Abraham's conscience. Abraham didn't need the sacrifice. God didn't need the sacrifice. Abraham needed it. And as the tradition goes on, that becomes more and more clear. You know, in August, we went down to Florida to visit my mom. And see, I don't know how your moms do it, but when we go visit, she has laid out on the beds these goodie baskets with like chocolates and coffees and all the sorts of things we like. And on this particular visit in August, she had laid on the guest bed these baskets, but in these baskets were my old notebooks and journals full of prayers and poems and my old sermon notes dating all the way back to high school. Because in high school, I fell in love with the notion that you could take these theological ideas and you could craft them and put words to them and put language to them and communicate them out to groups of people. I just found that fascinating, and I still find that fascinating. And I'm reading through this old notebook of sermon notes, and I came to an experience that brought me back to when I was 17, a sermon from when I was 17. And when I was 17, a big-time pastor from down south invited me to do a revival with him in Tennessee. Flew me down to Tennessee, and all expenses paid. It was a big deal. Apparently, according to these notes that I was reading in this notebook in Florida, I preached on this text, Genesis chapter 22, the story of Isaac and Abraham. And I was so proud of this sermon, and as I'm reading through these notes, the end of it, I ended the sermon, and it brought me back to the experience. I asked the question, and it was written in my notebook, are you willing, like Abraham, to give up everything for God, even the most important thing? Oh, and I was what a great question that was. I mean, I ended that way, and the music came in. It was the come as you are hymn, and we did the altar call. People got saved, but here's the problem. That question has nothing to do with that story. Oh, come on. How much can you give? Would you be willing to give everything, even the most important thing? That question actually undermines what that story is doing. That question actually undermines the new thing that God is doing. That question keeps all the guilt, all the shame, all the anxiety in circulation. And God came to do a new thing. And the new thing is so much better. That system of how much can you give? Come on, you want God on your side? How much? That's an old system. You see, I think the questions that this story could ask us are questions like, what is your God like? What is your God like? And have we simply created the same old gods and goddesses? We just call them by different names. That maybe you've been bowing down to the God of comparison and measuring up and the God of success. And what does this God demand of you? What are the sacrifices to be made? Is it the sacrifice of your family, your kids, your health, your wholeness, your presence? And when it comes to the God of success, how do you know when enough is enough? I mean, how much does this God demand? And maybe it's for you been the God of guilt, something of your past. What does this God demand of you? What's the thing that's most valuable to you? Is it your peace? And maybe if you could just keep on running fast enough and hard enough, then you don't have to actually deal with that thing. And maybe that will be the thing that appeases your God. Or is God just the game you play when life isn't going well? When life isn't going as planned? And then what does your altar look like? Oh, come on, God. If you do this thing for me, I promise I'll do this thing for you. Come on, God. If you get me out of this situation, I promise I'll live differently. What is your God like? I mean, maybe you've been trying to make the whole God project really complex, and you've been trying to figure out how to make God happy and what it takes to get God on your side, and this God comes and says, stop. Stop. I'm already on your side. There's nothing you could do to earn my favor. I'm already there. What's your God like? And how many times do we hear the phrase like, man, the gods must be angry with me. What'd I do to deserve this? Just 3 days ago, I was talking with a 23-year-old heroin addict. And he said in passing, it wasn't a big deal to him, but it was a big deal to me. He said, I don't know what I've done to get God so against me. Where does that come from? Oh, it's that same old system that's thousands of years old, but this God comes and says, stop. Stop. Or how about when we start trying to say God blesses some nations but not others, or God blesses some groups of people but not others, and we get into that point-scoring system game. Well, they did this, but we did this, and they do this, we do this, and God says, stop. That's an old system. Stop. Any system or idea or concept that tells you that you have to do something to earn God's favor, to get God on your side, to earn God's love, it's a bad system. It's not a Christian system, and it's not a system of love. If you have been working tirelessly telling yourself that God will love me, God won't love me unless, God will love me only if. This God says, stop. That's the invitation of this ancient story. Stop. My brothers and sisters, do we in 2018 need to be reintroduced to the God who says, stop. I'm already there. I don't demand anything. Stop.